In 1972, during a routine Tonight Show appearance, Dean Martin stopped talking mid-sentence. Johnny Carson didn't understand why, until he saw Dean's hands shaking as he reached for his cigarette. What happened next, during a commercial break that the audience never saw, would reveal a connection between Hollywood's most charming entertainer and a world that was never supposed to touch the Tonight Show stage. A man had stood up in the third row and walked out. That's all it took, because that man was Sam Giancana's nephew, and Dean Martin had just received a message on live television. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson was the most watched program in late-night television. Dean Martin was one of its most reliable guests, smooth, funny, effortlessly charismatic. When Dean was booked, the producers knew exactly what they'd get. Stories about Frank, a few jokes about drinking, that smile that made Middle America feel like they were in on something sophisticated and safe. But what happened on October 12th, 1972, was neither sophisticated nor safe. It started the way every Dean Martin appearance started, with applause, with Doc Severinsen's band hitting that familiar swing rhythm, with Johnny standing to greet his friend as Dean walked through the curtain in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, waving to the audience like a man who had never known a nervous moment in his life. The audience loved him. They always did. Dean had that rare quality. He made people feel better just by being in the room. He sat down in the guest chair, adjusted his cufflinks, accepted the cigarette Johnny offered, and leaned back with the kind of ease that can't be taught. "Dean Martin, ladies and gentlemen," Johnny said, grinning. "How are you, pal?" "I'm wonderful, John," Dean said, his voice smooth as bourbon. "You know me. I'm always wonderful." The audience laughed. This was the script. This was the Dean Martin they paid to see. But something was different tonight. Johnny noticed it first, a tightness around Dean's eyes, a half-second delay before the smile appeared. Professionals notice these things. Johnny had been doing this long enough to know when someone was working too hard to seem relaxed. "You've been busy," Johnny said, lighting his own cigarette. "What have you been up to?" "Oh, you know," Dean said, waving a hand. "A little golf, a little singing, a little of this, a little of that." "That's very specific, Dean." The audience laughed again. Dean laughed too, but Johnny saw him glance, just once, very quickly, toward the audience. Not at the audience, toward it, like he was checking for something. "I've been doing the show," Dean continued, settling back into the rhythm. "We've got some great guests coming up. Orson Welles is going to be on next week. Can you believe that? I'm going to ask him how he made Citizen Kane, and he's going to tell me, and I'm still not going to understand it." Johnny laughed. The audience laughed. This was good. This was the Dean Martin they knew. And then the man in the third row stood up. He didn't make a scene. That's what made it so terrible. He simply stood, a man in his mid-30s, dark suit, dark hair, expressionless, and walked toward the aisle. No hurry, no hesitation. He moved like someone leaving church in the middle of a sermon, polite but final. Dean saw him immediately. Johnny was mid-question, something about Frank Sinatra, something the audience would enjoy, when he realized Dean wasn't listening anymore. Dean's eyes had locked onto the man walking up the aisle toward the exit, and his face had gone completely still. Not blank. Still. There's a difference. Johnny turned to look, but by the time he did, the man was already at the door. The audience didn't react. People leave tapings all the time, bathroom breaks, emergencies, it happens. But Dean had stopped talking mid-word, his cigarette frozen halfway to his mouth. "Dean?" Johnny said quietly. Dean blinked. Once, twice. Then he turned back to Johnny with that smile again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "Sorry, John," he said. "What were you saying?" Johnny hesitated. The audience was still with them. They hadn't noticed the pause, or if they had, they thought it was part of the bit. But Johnny had noticed, and something in Dean's voice, something in the way his hand was shaking now as he finally brought the cigarette to his lips, told Johnny this wasn't part of any bit. "I was asking about Frank," Johnny said carefully. "Frank," Dean repeated, nodding too many times. "Yeah, Frank's good. Frank's real good." He was buying time. Johnny knew it. The audience didn't. "We're going to take a quick break," Johnny said suddenly, turning to the camera with his professional smile. "Stay with us. We'll be right back with Dean Martin." The red light went off. The second it did, Dean stood up. Not quickly, not dramatically. He just stood, still holding his cigarette, and stared at the exit door where the man had disappeared. "Dean," Johnny said again, standing now too. Dean didn't answer right away. He took a long drag from his cigarette, exhaled slowly, and then, very quietly, so quietly that Johnny almost didn't hear him, he said, "That was Momo's nephew." Johnny stared at him. "What?" Dean turned to look at him, and for the first time in all the years Johnny had known him, Dean Martin looked afraid. "Momo's nephew," Dean repeated. "Sam Giancana's nephew. That was him, in the third row." The studio was still buzzing around them, crew adjusting lights, producers talking into headsets, the audience chatting among themselves during the break. But in the little bubble of space between Johnny's desk and the guest chair, everything had gone very quiet. "What does that mean?" Johnny asked. Dean looked at him like he was trying to decide whether to answer. Then he sat back down, very slowly, and said, "It means I just got a message on your stage." To understand what happened next, you have to understand something about Dean Martin that the public never quite grasped. Dean wasn't just a singer. He wasn't just a comedian. He wasn't just Frank Sinatra's friend or Jerry Lewis's former partner or the charming drunk from the Rat Pack movies. Dean Martin had come up through a world that didn't make it onto The Tonight Show. He'd started in Steubenville, Ohio, the son of an Italian immigrant barber, in a town where the line between legitimate business and organized crime was more suggestion than boundary. He'd worked as a dealer in illegal gambling rooms before he was old enough to vote. He'd sung in clubs where the owners had names like Big Al and Trigger Mike, where the cash was kept in shoeboxes and nobody asked where it came from. By the time he made it to Hollywood, Dean had learned something essential: how to be charming enough that nobody asked questions, how to make people feel like they knew you while revealing absolutely nothing, how to move through the world like you had no past, no debts, no complications. But the past doesn't forget. Sam Giancana, Momo to his friends, was one of the most powerful organized crime figures in America during the 1960s. He ran Chicago. He had connections to Cuba, to Las Vegas, to the Kennedys. He was investigated by the FBI, subpoenaed by Congress, and according to some rumors, involved in plots that went all the way to the CIA. And he knew Frank Sinatra, which meant he knew Dean Martin. The exact nature of their relationship has never been fully documented. Some say it was purely social. Entertainers and mobsters moved in overlapping circles in Vegas. That's just how it was. Others say it went deeper, that favors were exchanged, that debts were owed. What's documented is this: Sam Giancana was murdered in 1975, shot 7 times in his own home the week before he was scheduled to testify before Congress. But in 1972, he was still alive, still powerful, still sending messages, and his nephew had just walked out of the Tonight Show taping. "You're sure it was him?" Johnny asked. Dean nodded. He'd lit another cigarette. His hands weren't shaking anymore, or rather they were shaking steadily now, which somehow seemed worse, I'm sure. "How do you know?" "Because I've seen him before," Dean said quietly. "At the Sands, at the Fontainebleau. You don't forget a face like that. You're not supposed to." Johnny sat on the edge of his desk. The crew was starting to glance over. They had maybe 2 more minutes before they had to go back on air. But Johnny couldn't move this along. Not yet. "What kind of message?" he asked. Dean looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "The kind you don't ask about." "Dean. John?" Dean's voice was still soft, but there was steel underneath it now. "You're a good friend. You've always been a good friend. But there are some things you don't want to know about. This is one of them." Johnny wanted to argue. He wanted to push. But something in Dean's face, something exhausted and resigned and much, much older than the man who'd walked through the curtain 20 minutes ago, stopped him. "Are you in trouble?" Johnny asked instead. Dean smiled. It was the saddest smile Johnny had ever seen. "I've been in trouble since 1947, Dean said. "I just got very good at pretending I wasn't." A producer approached, headset on, clipboard in hand. "We're back in 60 seconds, Johnny." Johnny nodded without looking at him. "Can you finish the show?" he asked Dean. Dean took a long drag from his cigarette, stubbed it out in the ashtray on Johnny's desk, and stood up. When he turned back to face Johnny, the mask was back on, the smile, the ease, the effortless charm that had made him a star. "Of course I can," Dean said. "That's what I do." and he walked back to the guest chair and sat down like nothing had happened. When the red light came back on, Dean Martin was perfect. He told stories about Bob Hope. He sang a verse from Everybody Loves Somebody. He made Johnny laugh, made the audience laugh, hit every mark and every cue like the professional he'd been for 30 years. But Johnny couldn't stop watching his eyes. There's a thing that happens when someone is performing at the absolute edge of their ability to hold it together, a kind of hyper-precision, where every gesture is exactly right because it has to be. Because if one thing slips, everything will slip. Dean was doing that now. "You ever think about slowing down?" Johnny asked, trying to keep his tone light. "Slowing down?" Dean laughed. "John, I've been slowing down my whole life. I just do it at a fast tempo." The audience loved it, but Johnny saw Dean's hand drift to his jacket pocket, an unconscious gesture, checking for something, making sure it was still there. "What have you got in there?" Johnny asked, half joking. "You smuggling something?" Dean froze for just a fraction of a second. Then he pulled his hand out, empty, and smiled. "Just my wallet," he said. "I'm very attached to my wallet." "I bet you are." They finished the segment. They shook hands. Dean stood, waved to the audience, and walked back through the curtain to thunderous applause. The second he was off stage, his shoulders dropped. Johnny saw it happen, saw the mask fall away, saw Dean's whole body sag like he'd been holding up something impossibly heavy, and had finally been allowed to set it down. Johnny wanted to follow him, wanted to ask what the hell was really going on. But the show wasn't over. There was still a musical guest, still a closing segment. So he stayed at his desk and did his job while Dean Martin disappeared into the maze of hallways behind Studio One. Dean's dressing room was at the end of a long hallway, past the green room, past the production offices, in a quiet corner where guests could decompress after taping. When Johnny finally made it back there, 20 minutes after the show wrapped, the door was half open. Dean was sitting in a chair by the mirror, still in his tuxedo, staring at a small piece of paper in his hand. Johnny knocked softly. "Can I come in?" Dean looked up. For a moment, he seemed surprised, like he'd forgotten where he was, or maybe like he'd been somewhere else entirely. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, come in." Johnny stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The room was small, functional. A couch, a mirror with lights, a rack of clothes, a mini fridge. Dean's jacket was draped over the back of the chair. His tie was loosened. "What's that?" Johnny asked, nodding at the paper. Dean looked down at it like he'd forgotten he was holding it. "Nothing," he said. Then, after a pause, "Everything." Johnny waited. Dean folded the paper once, twice, then slipped it into his shirt pocket. "You ever wonder how much of what we do is real?" he asked. "All the time," Johnny said. "I mean really real," Dean continued. "Not the jokes, not the bits. The part underneath, the part we don't show." Johnny sat down on the arm of the couch. "What happened tonight, Dean?" Dean was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You know how sometimes you make a deal, and at the time it seems like a good idea? Like the smart play?" Johnny nodded. "And then years go by and you forget you even made the deal. You build this whole life, this whole career, and it's good. It's real. You start to think maybe the deal doesn't matter anymore. Maybe it was just something that happened once, a long time ago, and now it's over." Dean looked up at Johnny, and his eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. "And then somebody stands up in the third row and walks out," Dean said. "And you remember." "Remember what?" Johnny asked quietly. "That nothing's ever really over," Dean said. "That some debts don't expire, that the people you made deals with, they don't forget, even if you do." Johnny felt something cold settle in his chest. What did the nephew want? "To remind me," Dean said. "That's all. Just to remind me that they're still there, that they're still watching, that when they need something, they'll call, and when they call—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "Jesus, Dean," Johnny said. Dean smiled. That sad, exhausted smile again. "It's okay, John. It's been okay for a long time. I knew what I was getting into. Or I thought I did. You don't get from Steubenville to Hollywood without help. And help isn't free." "What are they going to ask you to do?" "I don't know yet," Dean said. "Maybe nothing. Maybe this was just a reminder. That's how it works. You get a reminder every few years, just so you don't forget. And then one day, they call in the favor. And you do what they ask. And that's it." And if you don't, Dean looked at him, you don't want to know the answer to that. They sat in silence for a while, Dean in the chair by the mirror, Johnny on the arm of the couch, the small dressing room feeling suddenly very far away from the bright lights and laughter of the studio. Finally, Johnny said, "Why'd you come on the show tonight? If you thought something might happen." "Because it's the Tonight Show," Dean said simply. "Because it's your show. Because some things you don't cancel, no matter what's going on in the rest of your life." "Dean, I'm serious, John." Dean stood up, straightening his tie even though there was nowhere left to go tonight. "You think I don't know what you've built here? You think I don't see it? This show, it's the one place left where things still work the way they're supposed to. Where people laugh because something's funny, not because they're scared. Where you can be yourself without wondering who's watching." He looked at Johnny. "I wasn't going to let them take that away from me. Not tonight. Not on your stage." Johnny felt his throat tighten. "You could have told me." "No," Dean said. "I couldn't, because then you would have worried, and you would have tried to help. And there's no helping with this, John. There's just living with it." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and put it on, smoothing the lapels with practiced hands. "Besides," Dean said, and now the smile was back, smaller, more genuine, "I wanted one more good night. One more show where I got to be Dean Martin the way people think Dean Martin is. Before," he stopped. "Before what?" Johnny asked. Dean looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Before I have to be something else." Dean Martin finished putting on his jacket, checked his reflection in the mirror one last time, and walked to the door. Johnny stood up. "Dean." Dean turned back. "Yeah? If you need anything." "I know," Dean said. "I know where you are." And then he left. Johnny stood alone in the dressing room for a while after that, looking at the chair where Dean had been sitting, trying to process what he'd just learned. The truth was, he'd always known there was something underneath Dean's charm. Everyone in the business knew it. You didn't get that smooth without having something to be smooth about. But knowing it abstractly and seeing it in someone's eyes are two different things. Dean Martin had spent 30 years building a persona so perfect, so effortlessly charismatic, that nobody thought to look underneath. He was the guy who made everything seem easy, the guy who never broke a sweat, the guy who always had a drink in his hand and a smile on his face and a joke ready to go. But tonight, for just a few minutes, Johnny had seen the man underneath the persona, and that man was afraid. The Tonight Show episode from October 12th, 1972, aired as scheduled. Dean Martin's appearance was exactly as charming as expected. The audience laughed in all the right places. The reviews were positive. Nobody mentioned the man who walked out during the taping. Nobody noticed the slight tremor in Dean's hand when he reached for his cigarette. Nobody saw what happened during the commercial break, or in the dressing room afterward, or the conversation that would haunt Johnny Carson for years. Because that's the thing about television, it shows you exactly what it wants you to see. Everything else happens in the spaces between. Dean Martin continued making appearances on The Tonight Show for years after that night. He was always professional, always charming, always the Dean Martin America loved. But Johnny never forgot. He never forgot the way Dean's face had gone still when the nephew stood up. Never forgot the sadness in Dean's smile when he said, "Some debts don't expire." Never forgot that underneath the tuxedo and the charm and the carefully constructed persona, Dean Martin had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. 3 years later, in 1975, Sam Giancana was murdered in his home. The investigation went nowhere. The case was never solved. The people who might have known something weren't talking. And Dean Martin kept singing and smiling and making people laugh, right up until his son died in 1987, and something inside him finally, permanently broke. But on that night in 1972, in a dressing room at the end of a quiet hallway in Burbank, California, Johnny Carson saw something that the cameras never caught. The moment Dean Martin realized that no matter how far you run, no matter how successful you become, no matter how perfect your performance, some messages always find you. There's a kind of loneliness that comes with being famous in the way Dean Martin was famous. You spend your whole life building this thing, this character, this persona, And it works so well that after a while, you're not sure where the character ends and you begin. People love you for what you show them. They laugh at your jokes, they buy your records, they invite you into their homes through their television screens. But they don't know you. They can't know you. Because knowing you would mean seeing the deals you made and the compromises you accepted and the things you did to get from there to here. And those things don't fit the image. Those things would ruin the magic. So you keep them hidden. You perform the version of yourself that people want to see. And if you're good enough at it, if you're Dean Martin good at it, people forget there's anything underneath. Sometimes you forget too, until a man stands up in the third row and walks out, until a reminder arrives that can't be ignored, until you're sitting in a dressing room at the end of the night, holding a piece of paper that weighs more than it should, and the only person who knows is someone who can't help you because there is no help for this. That's the loneliness. Not being unknown. Being known only in the ways that don't matter. Johnny Carson understood this better than most. He'd built his own persona, the Midwest nice guy, the professional, the host who kept the show running smoothly night after night. He knew what it cost to maintain that image. He knew about the divorces that didn't fit the narrative, the drinking that stayed private, the loneliness of being the person everyone thought they knew. But Dean's burden was different. Dean wasn't just hiding personal pain or private struggles. Dean was carrying something that connected him to a world where messages were delivered through walked-out audiences and cryptic reminders, and the understanding that some debts never expire. And there was nothing Johnny could do about it. That's what haunted him afterward. Not that Dean was in trouble, but that the trouble was so far beyond anything television could touch. You can't joke your way out of it. You can't charm your way past it. You can't do an interview and make it go away. All you can do is what Dean did, smile, light another cigarette, and give the audience what they came for, even when it's killing you, especially when it's killing you. The real end of the story is that there is no end. Dean Martin kept performing, kept appearing on talk shows and variety specials and making records, kept being Dean Martin, because that's what he'd been doing for so long that he didn't know how to stop. Johnny Carson kept hosting The Tonight Show, kept bringing on guests and telling jokes and maintaining the illusion that television was a place where everything was light and funny and safe. And the world kept turning, blissfully unaware that on one October night in 1972, something had cracked. Not broken, just cracked, in a way that only two people in the room fully understood. The nephew never came back to another taping. The message had been delivered, and Dean Martin, smooth, charming, effortlessly cool Dean Martin, went home that night and probably poured himself a real drink, not the apple juice he used on stage, and sat in the dark for a while, thinking about Steubenville and Vegas and all the years in between, thinking about the price of getting out, and wondering if he ever really did. The Tonight Show was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be the place where America went to forget about the complicated, scary, messy parts of life. Johnny Carson's desk was the one place where everything was under control. But on October 12, 1972, that illusion shattered, just for a moment, just in the space of a commercial break, just long enough for Johnny to see the truth. Dean Martin had spent decades building a wall between his past and his present. He'd become so good at being the charming singer, the funny drunk, the reliable entertainer, that everyone forgot to ask where he'd come from or what he'd done to get there. Until Sam Giancana's nephew stood up and walked out. The cameras didn't catch it. The audience didn't understand it. The official record doesn't mention it. But it happened. And for the rest of his life, Johnny Carson carried the memory of Dean Martin's face in that moment. The fear, the resignation, the exhaustion of carrying a weight that nobody else could see. That's the thing about television. It shows you the performance, but the truth happens in the commercial breaks, in the dressing rooms, in the quiet conversations that nobody hears. And sometimes the most important moments are the ones the cameras never catch.